Welcome to the MIT Libraries. I'm Kaija Langley. I'm the Director of Development for the Libraries. And before we get started, I'd like to ask for all devices in the room to please be silenced or vibrate as we are filming this program for later viewing. So thank you very much. We are so pleased to have you join us today for Book Wars, featuring Richard Ovenden, Bodley's librarian at Oxford University, and author of Burning the Books, A History of the Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge. Today's event will also feature a discussion led by Malick Ghachem, professor and head of history at MIT. I'd like to start today's program with MIT's land acknowledgement. MIT acknowledges indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag, Massachusetts, and other tribal nations. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected from time immemorial to this land on which we gather today. Today's event not only marks the beginning of Banned Books Week, it is the first in a new series called Conversations on Academic Freedom and Expression, or CAFÉ. This is a collaboration between the libraries and history at MIT. We are so pleased that Professor Ghachem looked to the libraries to partner for this series. The MIT Libraries cares deeply about open access to information, and like all libraries, we value the freedom to seek and to express ideas. I am personally indebted to the meaningful work of libraries as a trustee for the Cambridge Public Library and an author of children's books. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Malick Ghachem, a historian and lawyer. His primary areas of concentration are slavery and abolition, criminal law, and constitutional history. He is a professor of history, the head of the history at MIT, and a research affiliate at the Center for International Studies. Please join me in welcoming Malick to the podium.
Great, thank you very much, Kaija, so much for that nice introduction. Thank you so much to the MIT Library staff for your support of this event and this series. Thank you also to MIT Open Learning for supporting this inaugural event. And welcome to everybody. This is the first, as Kaija was saying, in a series called Conversations on Academic Freedom and Expression. And our idea here is really just to kind of introduce the MIT community to the broader landscape of what's going on in the world of academic freedom and free expression, kind of beyond some of our local controversies and exchanges. So that's the idea, and we're aiming as much as possible to have this in a conversational format. So after Richard talks, he and I will join in a little one-on-one exchange, and then of course we'll open it up to all of you. Okay, so Richard Ovenden is Bodley's librarian at Oxford University in the UK. He was appointed to that position in 2014. He is also the director there of the Bodleian Center for the Study of the Book. Richard is very involved in issues involving digital preservation, archival access, information science, the library industry as a whole. In addition to several board positions, he's president of the Digital Preservation Coalition. He is a historian of photography. He's published a book on John Thompson. And most relevant for our purposes, he is the author, as of 2020, of the book whose image you see on the screen up there, Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack, which was shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize. He is a member of numerous honorary societies, including the Royal Society of Arts, the Royal Historical Society, the Society of Antiquaries, the American Philosophical Society, and he is a fresh out of the oven member of the American Association of Arts and Sciences, was inaugurated this past Saturday. Congratulations, Richard. Welcome to MIT, and thank you for joining us.
So thank you very much indeed, Malick, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming and listening. And I was kind of wondering how to do this, but I'm just going to do this. In support of librarians here in the US and the American Library Association and their great work that they do to support freedom of expression. And it's particularly meaningful for me as a librarian to be inaugurating this event here in this library at the start of Banned Books Week. So I'm going to, I'm a librarian and I'm a historian, so I'm just going to sort of start this by pointing out that libraries have a long existence, and that long existence really begins in the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia. We know amazing amounts about libraries and archives in those civilizations and those kingdoms. And actually, in one or two instances, we can see an actual library space. There were 800 cuneiform tablets were found in this location. And, the profession, here's the library of Celsus, in what is now Turkey, and libraries evolved over a long period of time and became increasingly, and they had their ups and downs. They became increasingly more sophisticated. The profession became more sophisticated. Many cultures had their own versions of libraries and archives, which again had their own trajectories of development and sophistication and professionalization. And today, obviously, libraries, this is our off-site storage facility in Oxford, or just outside Oxford. And, the libraries in the Western world have grown and become very sophisticated organizations. But they are organizations which have people at the heart of them. And the people, the librarians and archivists who run them, and to some extent the readers and scholars and students who use them, have been part of that process of development. But I think it's important to start off by saying that because libraries and archives are about the people who work in them, who run them, who plan them, who design them, they are also subject to all the flaws that those human beings portray and hold within them. And so I'd just like to make that point at the outset. And of course, libraries today like this, I've just enjoyed walking around this beautiful library, the post kind of renovation. It looks absolutely stunning. And they're increasingly under attack. And that's what I'm going to come back to later in my talk. But I'm going to begin by looking at that attack, those attacks through history, and what the motivations for that were, to some extent still are, and what the responses of librarians and archivists and scholars and those committed to the preservation of knowledge have been through that history. So although my book, Burning the Books, sounds like a kind of depressing read, in some ways it is, trigger warning, but in other ways, it is, I hope, an uplifting tale, because there is that human impulse to preserve, to pass on, to bear witness, to allow for a diversity of ideas to flourish. And of course, the way that libraries work, most of the reading that's done certainly in my library, is done online, via online. That's the kind of stuff that gets read. But that too, as we transfer into that digital domain, that does not mean that the attacks on libraries or on freedom of expression have expired. Quite the contrary, they're just a whole new battlefields. And I think it's worth pointing out one of the triggers for me writing the book was going to Berlin a few years ago and just stumbling. I didn't go there for the purpose. I just stumbled upon the site in Berlin where this event took place on the 10th of May 1933, where students, let's remember, students, organized plundering of nearby libraries and bookshops and piled those books, and including the library of an Institute for Human Sexuality, and piled those books in a great pile, poured petrol on them, and set fire to it. All, of course, orchestrated by the Nazi Party, by Goebbels. And you can kind of see the lights of the searchlights because it was filmed and coordinated with over 90 other locations in Berlin, in Germany that night had similar events. And book burning is not something that is history. It's not a historical phenomenon. It is a present phenomenon. So as you can see, the 17th of September, I screenshotted that from Twitter, where some individuals in this country felt that it was okay to set flamethrowers on piles of books which had been in banned lists from libraries in their state. And it struck me that we forget the book burnings of the past, but there is a kind of continuous tradition, unfortunately, that we need to be aware of. And it's not just those kind of very violent, very kind of upfront acts, but more subtle acts of destruction. I was moved to write an opinion piece in the Financial Times a few years ago, learning that a government department, the Home Office, who were perpetrating a policy against immigrants in the country called the hostile environment, to give you a sense of its character, and forcing fellow citizens who'd come to the UK from the former Commonwealth and Empire countries after World War II, and they were forced to prove through documentation their right to settled status. And at the same time as instigating the policy, the same government department destroyed a whole archive of records that those same citizens could have used to prove their right to remain. So it struck me that this was a good example of the social importance of the preservation of knowledge. And of course, around the same time, we had the idea that there could be such things as alternate facts, suggested by Kellyanne Conway, President Trump's press secretary, to try and explain the facts that more people attended Barack Obama's inauguration than had attended President Trump's. And so to explain this, there became this idea that there were alternate facts. And so, I encourage you to go back to 1984 if you've not read it, or like me, hadn't read it for a very long time. I see this very much as a kind of a foretelling of the age in which we live. But my kind of argument, I guess, is that libraries and archives are institutions that help society cling to the truth. And so going back to those ancient libraries, one of the things that we learn from looking at the scholarship, and there's immense, very interesting scholarship on those libraries. This is the library of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, one of the most famous of the rulers of the Mesopotamian civilizations, and who amassed what scholars now suggest is the first library that we know of to try to encompass the whole of human knowledge. And there are about 20,000 cuneiform tablets of Ashurbanipal's library that survive in the British Museum, about 10,000 in other institutions around the world. And they were dug up by a Brit called Austin Henry Layard. Kind of looking back on it now, it seems very dubious that all of this great treasure from central Iraq is now mostly in London. But setting that issue to one side, because of those excavations, we know a huge amount about the libraries. And one of the things that we know is that the library of Ashurbanipal was built through theft, through deliberate destruction of other libraries in his neighboring enemy kingdoms like Babylonia, to try and make him more powerful, because many of those texts were about the prediction of the future. How, you know, when is the best time to plant a crop? When is the best time to have a child? And so on. And so by stealing texts which tell you, give you answers to those things, you make your enemies weaker and yourself stronger. So that sort of politics of knowledge goes back thousands and thousands of years. And of course, here's John Martin's depiction of the fall of Nineveh, which is how the library of Ashurbanipal survives, because it was kind of buried under ash for centuries. And I'm going to kind of leap forward in time to the Reformation of the 16th century, another period of kind of wholesale destruction of knowledge. This is I'm taking this photograph of where the library of the Abbey of Glastonbury, one of the great monastic houses in medieval England, with a great library, which was dissolved in the first phase of the English Reformation in 1539, in a very violent series of acts where the abbot was hung, drawn, and quartered. And the library, which must have been about 2,000 books on the eve of the Reformation, only 60 of them survive. And we know of that survival thanks to an archive that's fortunately in my library. On the left-hand screen is part of that archive, written by a man called John Leland, who was employed by Henry VIII to search the libraries of England to help him find texts that would support his argument to divorce Catherine of Aragon and to marry Anne Boleyn. And the bottom of that list, you'll see it says Grammatica Uticis Liber Olim Sancti Dunstani. And that is a book of a now forgotten grammatical writer that was owned by St Dunstan. And in fact, on the other picture is that very book that John Leland consulted in 1533 in Glastonbury Abbey. The book survives, and you can see the oldest self-portrait in English art, the Abbot St Dunstan, the Abbot of Glastonbury, later Archbishop of Canterbury, kneeling at the foot of Christ. So this is one of just 60 books that survived from that great institutional library. And a similar thing happened to Oxford University Library. So here is the original library building, which dates from 1320. It moved to a building that still survives. It's still part of the library today, called Duke Humphreys Library, and had grown by the eve of the second phase of the English Reformation in 1549 to be around 600 books. And the commissioners of Edward VI visited the library and destroyed it. The books were removed from the library, the pages were torn out and sold to butter makers to wrap butter in, and pie makers to line pie dishes, or in this case, to bookbinders to strengthen the bindings of the new technology of print. And it came to the attention of Sir Thomas Bodley. He was the re-founder of the library about 30 years later, who re-established the institution, rebuilt the physical structure of the building, stocked it full of books, endowed my post, and at the heart of what he did in the design of the library and the library statutes was preservation. So how to protect the books, which just a few generations before had been destroyed. And it was very visible to his generation that the great plundering of those libraries, and anybody who, and he was pretty much an extreme Protestant, but even he regretted the loss of knowledge and built the institution to be dedicated to that preservation task. And that's something in the subsequent century that remained true. You know, it kind of entered the DNA of the organization. So, for example, the poet John Milton gave a volume of his poems to my predecessor, the second librarian, John Rouse, a very beautiful with a manuscript dedication. And then after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, when the regicides, the people who had signed the death warrant of Charles I or had committed themselves intellectually to the execution of the king, their books were ordered by government decree to be burned in the quadrangle outside of the library. But my predecessor, Thomas Hyde, the fifth librarian, refused to give the book up, and he hid it. He removed it from the catalogue, and he hid the volume. We still have it today, but that must have been a very risky task at a time of, sort of ideological tension. I'd like to turn to this country now and to this amazing kind of mezzotint, but in particular to the events that are in the background to the portrait of Admiral Cockburn, the leader of a British expeditionary force to the United States that burned Washington, D.C. in 1840. Now, I'm sure you all know the story, but it was not taught to me as a history student at school or even at university, but a very interesting episode, which we actually have an eyewitness account of, the destruction of the Library of Congress, which took place in August 1814, and that is actually an Oxford alum, George Gleig, who, although he felt that the burning of Washington was a scene that he'd never seen anything more sublime, he did in fact regret that a noble library, several printing offices and the National Archives were committed to the flames, which no doubt the property of government might better have been spared. So the destruction of the Library of Congress, and here you can see the Capitol building. It's the only stone building in Washington at the time, and it housed the government offices, the office of the president, the Library of Congress, and the seats of the two houses. And you can see the smoke stains out of the windows. And of course, this came to the attention of Thomas Jefferson, who was living in his estate in Virginia at Monticello and had the greatest private library in America at the time. And he heard about it. He wrote a letter to a Washington newspaper, horrified, and kind of invoked the Library of Alexandria and felt that this was a great barbaric act by the British, which, no argument there. But he offered his own library to replace the burned books. About 5,000 were destroyed. And it took months for Congress to decide whether or not to actually vote the money to buy Jefferson's library, but they ended up doing so, which kind of enabled the Library of Congress to kind of get back on its feet with 7,000 new books and new, amazing books from the kind of cutting edge of European thought at the time. The Holocaust of the 20th century, to kind of skip many decades, was perhaps the most destructive for libraries and books in recorded history. It's been estimated that about 100 million books were destroyed during the Holocaust, the extended period of the Holocaust from, say, 1933. And I'm going to focus for a few slides on Vilnius, or Vilna, as it was known, the capital of Lithuania, a city famous for its learned rabbis, famous for its libraries, like the Strasbourg Library, which was given to the Jewish community in Vilna by a wealthy bibliophile businessman. And it had, on the eve of the Holocaust, a very busy reading room, a learned librarian. And there was a newer institution called YIVO, an institution dedicated to the preservation of non-religious culture of Jewish life in Central and Eastern Europe. And a very vibrant organization that had field workers going to collect Yiddish newspapers, theater programs, medical case notes, you name it. If it documented the life of ordinary Jewish communities, their everyday life, they collected it in the YIVO Institute. But in 1941, Operation Barbarossa was unleashed, and behind the stormtroopers came kind of cultural stormtroopers. And these were organized by the man on the left, who was called Alfred Rosenberg, the kind of chief architect of anti-Semitism, who established an institute, kind of perverted research institute in Frankfurt called the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question. And they had a library, and the library was formed by plundering Jewish libraries around in occupied territories. And that act was done by an operational group led by the man who was a librarian called Johannes Pull. And he and his team went into cities after they were occupied and organized the plunder of those libraries. And that's exactly what happened in Vilna, where librarians and archivists were moved like the whole Jewish population into the ghetto. They were identified and brought out every day to search through the libraries that they had been responsible for just weeks earlier. And the books that they had to sort through were put into two categories: unique and important books that were sent back to Rosenberg's Institute in Frankfurt, or books, the rest, that were sent for destruction. And you can imagine, there were some librarians in the room. This would be a very difficult, very painful thing indeed to do. Even more painful for those who've been collecting those books in, for example, the YIVO Institute. And they were called by the German guards the Paper Brigade. But what they ended up doing was smuggling pages of documents and books back into the ghetto in their clothing every night. They came up with all sorts of ruses. They said, oh, we need the paper to light the ovens in the ghetto. Or they would say, we need more furniture for the schoolroom. So they would hide documents in the tubular frame of the furniture. And they managed to hide the collections that they smuggled in, a great personal risk. If they'd been found, they would have been killed in the ghetto itself, in the hope that some of them would survive or that someone would encounter them later on. And a similar thing happened in other parts of occupied Central and Eastern Europe. So in Warsaw, a group called Ovenden Szabes, led by a remarkable man called Emanuel Ringelblum, collected documents that showed the life of the Warsaw Ghetto, what it was like to live in the Warsaw Ghetto. So simple things like the wrappers of food, or they had the most moving children's drawings from the nursery schools. And they hid them in metal canisters and in milk cartons, and they were hidden. The members of Ovenden Szabes were all murdered when the ghetto was liquidated. But the trove of documents, 2 of the 3 caches were discovered, and they're in Warsaw today. Now, let's go back to Vilna. The documents hidden in the ruins of the Vilna ghetto were uncovered and rebuilt when the Soviet troops entered the city. And a few members of the Paper Brigade had escaped when the ghetto was liquidated and joined the Soviet army, and they re-established the YIVO Institute and some of the other libraries. And then American troops came upon the Frankfurt Institute and its collection of libraries and identified them, and in an activity that you might think of as the Monuments Men, which the focus has all been on works of art, but actually much of their work was dedicated to books and archives. They found that the YIVO Institute had a branch in New York City and sent the books that they found with the stamp of the Vilna libraries, including the YIVO. And here you can see in New York the YIVO staff uncovering the packing cases from Frankfurt. But a tragedy happened to the books and documents that had stayed in Vilna. So remember, they'd been smuggled out into the ghetto by the Paper Brigade, hidden there, and then as the Soviet troops entered, they'd been recovered. The communist administration in Vilna decided after a couple of years that they were anti-communist, and they sent them to the paper mills for destruction again. This time, a Lithuanian librarian called Antanas Ulpis discovered what was happening, drove some of the trucks back, and hid the documents in an outpost of the National Library of Lithuania in a disused church, including hiding documents in the organ pipes. And he kept it a secret until 1989. So the events that took place in August the 25th, 1992, so this is not long ago, in Sarajevo during the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, included the deliberate shelling with incendiary shells of the National Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the National and University Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina. No other buildings were targeted this day. It was deliberately targeted by the Serb militia, and librarians and firefighters who tried to get collections out of the burning building were then targeted with sniper fire, including Ada Butarovic, who was murdered that day. And this actually heralded not just the destruction of the National Library, which in some way encapsulated Bosnian culture at the time. So it had Muslim documents, it had Jewish documents, it had Christian documents, and it documented, the complicated multicultural history of that country. And that's what the Serbs wanted to destroy. But it didn't stop there. So libraries in mosques, land registries that documented Muslim land occupation were destroyed. That eradication of memory, of history, was what was happening. And yesterday I had lunch with a fabulous librarian, now retired, called Andras Riedelmeier, who did amazing work to survey and document all of the destroyed libraries in Bosnia and Kosovo, and gave evidence at the trials of Slobodan Milosevic and Ratclan Mladic in the International War Crime Tribunal in The Hague, looking them eye to eye and listing all of the attacks on knowledge that they had perpetrated. So I'd like to end by just giving you some of my thoughts about libraries and archives today, and coming back to the theme of freedom of expression. And my kind of strap line is that libraries and archives are the infrastructure of democracy. And there are 5 reasons, 5 categories that I use to support that assertion. The first is a kind of obvious one about education. You don't need me to kind of spell that out very much in this institution. But I like to, there are a few, there's a remark, the application for a reader's ticket at the British Museum Library, now the British Library, by Sylvia Pankhurst is very moving, where she describes that she needs to understand information about the employment of women. And she cannot get this in other libraries. She must have admission to the British Museum Library. So you can see the power. Here's one of my colleagues in the Bodleian with one of our engrossments of Magna Carta, talking to students who are from schools that don't normally send their pupils to apply to Oxford. And again, bringing it back to this city, you may be familiar with the film Spotlight. If you actually read the story behind that, there's an amazing account of them, these investigative journalists trying to track perpetrators of child sexual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church. And they do it in libraries. And they do it with the most boring documents and books that you can imagine. These are Catholic parish newsletters. These are registries of members of the Catholic Church, decades out of date. The kind of things that many people would throw away, thinking this is useless, this is not going to be of any use to anyone. But they used it forensically to track the movements of these priests as they were moved from community to community, and the kind of correlating it with the awful acts that were perpetrated onto children. And that eventually they were able to use that evidence to bring those individuals to justice. And you can see the importance of education by looking at the libraries that had been established in the decade or so before August 2021. I wrote about it in the FT, where those libraries, particularly libraries for the education of young women were the first to be targeted by the Taliban in August 21. Libraries and archives, and particularly archives, preserve the rights of citizens. So we saw that in, the attack on them by the Serbs in land registries. We saw it in 1989 where Germans, before the age of social media and cell phones, it simultaneously occupied Stasi headquarters to stop the Stasi from destroying the files on their own citizenry because they wanted access to the information about surveillance on them as individuals. They wanted it to be kept. And in fact, the German state created a whole archival organization and changed the law to make it a right of citizens to access their own Stasi file. And if you see the website of the Supreme Court of the United States was surveyed by the Harvard Law Library in 2011 and discovered that no fewer than 40% of the web links were broken on that website. And you kind of realize how important it is for a healthy democratic society to have access to the laws of the land. Well, if the website isn't being properly maintained, that's going to be quite difficult. Libraries and archives are reference points for facts and truth. I like to invoke an Oxonian here, kind of a very aged but a wonderful quote about verifying your references. Now, we can joke at that, but I think that sort of in the age of alternate facts, how important is it to have trusted knowledge? And I think libraries and archives have very important work to do, and it's in our DNA to preserve knowledge, but to provide those permanent, persistent identifiers, whether they're the shelf marks of manuscripts or DOIs and pearls and arcs and all of those other things that our community has developed. And of course, as we've moved as a society across the globe to entrusting knowledge to what my colleague in Oxford, Timothy Garton-Ash, calls the private superpowers, a small number of major technology companies, we're increasingly aware that their preservation is not in their business model. And if we want to be able to hold the public statements of individuals to account, if we want to be able to analyze these knowledge sources, we need access to an archive of their information. And again, Facebook has no archival responsibility. So the National Library of New Zealand, for example, has a project inviting citizens of New Zealand to donate their Facebook profiles so that some record can be maintained. And in 2020, I wrote about the dangers in the UK, of government officials using encrypted technologies like WhatsApp. And I said that these really should come under the purview of the 1958 Public Records Act and considered as public records. And then in 2022, it's actually government by WhatsApp that brought down the Boris Johnson administration. And you saw how Donald Trump basically ran his political campaign with a smartphone and a Twitter account. But he also deleted a huge number of his tweets, or his office staff did. So again, there's actually an activist archivist group called FactBase who screenshotted his Twitter feed to provide a record of that. And again, interestingly, this is just from a few months ago, where an Oxford alum found his doctoral dissertation being doctored online to give a completely opposite political view on nationalist policy than he actually held. But fortunately, we have not only the hard copy but a digitized version of it, and we were able to kind of correct the record that his thesis was in fact doctored and faked. Libraries and archives help preserve the identity of communities and society, and you only need to look at what's happening in Ukraine right now, where hundreds of libraries have been attacked. it's quite difficult to know exactly how many have been destroyed, but dozens of libraries have been completely destroyed. And in occupied territories, books on Ukrainian or in Ukrainian language are removed by Russian troops and burned in the streets. And, you know, our community, our library colleagues are being very creative, turning the stacks into bomb shelters. And you know, again, the web space is under attack, so there are great initiatives which we're part of, like Susho, which are trying to preserve the Ukrainian web space. I'm going to speed through this. So I'm going to end with the topic of diversity. So I think, you know, there's very good arguments, I think, and this brings us back to freedom of expression, to the idea that a diversity of opinion is an absolute prerequisite for an open society, for a democratic society. And I have a little story to tell. One of my previous jobs was in Edinburgh University Library, had a small number of Islamic manuscripts, including one which contained an illustration of the Prophet coming out of his mummy's tummy. And I received a telephone call one day from a gentleman who said that I should take this manuscript outside and burn it. And I decided not to do that. And then, and this is an illumination from the manuscript, not the contested image in question, but it's that image, not this one, but the one of the Prophet, which was being shown by an art historian in Hamline University. Was it even last year or the year before? I can't remember. 2020, yeah, it was last year. Resulting, there were complaints from students. She lost her job. And I read about this and I thought, is that from the Rashid al-Din? That I used to be, that somebody told me to go out, take outside and burn. And then I happened to stumble in the Oxford University Press very short introduction to Islam to see that the first edition had that picture printed in it, but subsequent editions had a disclaimer. So these issues are very difficult ones to deal with. So there are, you know, legitimately held views that that image, the depiction of the Prophet, is a blasphemous thing to do, but the kind of violence or the violent intentions that go around that are, I think, ones which we should resist. And the lecturer at Hamline did give a warning before, saying, you know, this, I'm going to show a picture of the Prophet. If you find it offensive, please feel free to leave the room. So I think it's a very kind of difficult issue, but one in which I think we need to kind of stick to those principles that if we treat them in the right way, that we should be allowed to depict, to show a depiction of the Prophet, which was, after all, created by Muslims. And it's been, you know, there was a very interesting article in The Guardian by Keenan Malick, himself a Muslim, saying that, you know, most Muslims would not regard that as a blasphemous image. So, you know, they're very difficult, subtle issues, which brings us to America this year, where the kind of epidemic of book banning has been quite astonishing to see just how, and it must have been kind of simmering away for several years, and has now come to visit many states with thousands of books being on those lists, and librarians being challenged not just legally, but their library services being closed down in order to search for, you know, the wrong kinds of books. The lists being possible to be added to by very small numbers of people. Library boards being, you know, organizations taking over places on library boards. and it being a very, very contested space. And it's been very inspiring to see how the library community has organized themselves, has worked to fight against the book banning in a number of ways. The American Library Association's toolkit has been excellent. There have been other groups like Freedom and Unite Against Book Bans who've been, doing similar impressive works. And then it's kind of also obviously come to the attention of the writers whose books are being banned in schools and in libraries. And I'm very struck by Margaret Atwood's article in The Atlantic, who was kind of, in some ways, quite enthusiastic about book banning because her books had never sold so well. And I've also been impressed with libraries like the Brooklyn Public Library, like the LA Public Library, like the NYPL, who've been digitizing books and making them available online to, equalize across the state boundaries. And again, that's been inspiring to see. And it's also been inspiring to see how that organization, those fightbacks, the publicity, the work of libraries and library organizations has seen reversals in many states and has seen politicians taking notice of what is happening and actually doing something about it. And I think I'm just going to end, and I screenshotted this on Saturday, that nothing says banned book week like an attempt to ban Book Week. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Richard. Shall we sit over here
Okay,
and have a little exchange?
I can't remember.
I think you're over there, I'm
over in
here,
this one?
but it doesn't really matter. Okay. Wow. Fantastic. Banning Book Week does take Orwell to another level, doesn't it? So, I'm glad you sort of ended on the American scene there because, by the way, thank you for a fantastic talk. Because it sometimes seems to me that we have two conversations about free expression that are going on in the United States. One of them involves canceled lectures and similar motifs. That's the stuff that falls under the rubric of what we call cancel culture, or what some people call cancel culture in the United States. And then there's this whole other conversation, which your talk evokes, which is about banned books and libraries, and these two conversations have very different political valences, is my impression, in the United States. It's almost as if they appear on opposing political networks. One to the exclusion of the other. So I wondered if we could just kind of try and bring these two conversations into contact with one another, and see what the history of books has to tell us about them. So here's a few questions to kind of get that going. And I want to begin by quoting from your own book, Burning the Books here, where you talk about the history of collection, history of library collection. And Richard says, quote, "The processes of selection, acquisition, and cataloging, as well as of disposal and retention, are never neutral acts. They are done by human beings working in their social and temporal contexts. The past behavior of humans involved in the creation of collections was therefore subject to bias, prejudice, and personality." And then you go on to explain that, well, the people who do this work are library staff, are librarians. They're the people who, you say, turn the pile of books into an organized body of knowledge. Okay. So the question is, kind of taking that as our historical baseline, that in fact library collections as they exist today are not the product of a neutral selection process. But nonetheless, the librarian today is in sort of the eye of this media whirlwind involving bias and politicization, et cetera. How do you conceive of the function of the librarian today in relationship to this debate about neutrality versus political bias in the composition of the library?
So I get asked a similar kind of question a lot. So my book came out in 2020, and I did mostly Zoom talks at the start because of the pandemic. And very often the first question at the end would be, but isn't this just the same as cancel culture? I said, shelling the National Library of Bosnia with incendiary bombs and targeting librarians with sniper fire is not the same as cancel culture. So you cannot equate the two things together. So there is a kind of spectrum there, but I think there are two important things that need to be remembered. The first is that, of course, library collections have to be selected by individuals. Otherwise, you have to build a very large library to have every book ever published in the world inside it. So that is not feasible. So some selection has to happen. And that selection is done by trained, qualified, experienced individuals who tend to work to policies, collection development policies, which are acquisitions policies, which are very often public documents. They're created through consultation, through, and they're often online. They're put on the websites of those organizations. So there's nothing kind of hidden in this day and age around those kind of policies and procedures. And of course there is bias that human beings will say, oh, I kind of like this book, I'm going to buy it. But so they can and should and do reflect the mores of our age, the focuses of our age, but they are not exclusive. You're not forced to read any of those books. No one is putting a gun at your head like members of the paper brigade. You know, there is a freedom of choice by the patron to read or not to read. Just as there is a freedom around the selection of those tasks, of those books within the task of collection development, which is set around policies. And so there's a huge difference there, and we can't conflate academic freedom with freedom of expression. These are two different things. You know, you as the head of the history department make choices all the time about who to hire in your faculty.
I wish I did, but rarely.
Well, you and your colleagues
Rarely.
will. You don't admit everyone for the sake of allowing everyone to have freedom of expression. You make choices.
Right. So, yes, okay, great. So that's really helpful, particularly on the distinction between free expression and academic freedom. But I wonder if you still think, I mean, it seems to me that there was a bit of holding out of the library as a model for how a society committed to free inquiry should organize itself. And I wonder if you might extend that model to the functioning of the university itself, to how labs run, to how classrooms operate, to how we hold lectures or don't hold lectures. Is the kind of the comprehensiveness of the research library, which seeks to make available, you know, as much, as close as possible, the sum total of human knowledge to researchers. Is that a good model for education, for how for how teachers do their job, for how researchers research their fields? Or is the library a kind of in a special category of its own in terms of its universality, or at least an aspiration to universality and comprehensiveness, et cetera, that distinguishes it from what goes on in a classroom or lecture hall, et cetera?
I mean, I think it's both of those things in a funny way. I mean, I don't think you can equate a library like this one, which attempts to support all of the academic endeavour of this institution, with a particular department or institute within MIT. Right. Because there are kind of very specialist interests. But if you step back and to look at the academy as a whole, there is a spectrum of subject matter and approaches that exist both within the faculty and the curricula and within the student body. And I think it's important that we allow space for all of those ideas to flourish and to interact with one another. But the arrangements in a library are such that there is documentation, there are physical and virtual spaces that allow that interaction of knowledge. There is expertise from the library staff to both select and acquire the material, to organize it, to curate the spaces of interaction, whether they're physical or digital. And I think that the care in which library staff go about curating their collections and the spaces for engagement, you walk around this library, it's calming. It's not a kind of violent space. It's a cautious space. It's one in which deliberation takes place, where people are able to consider things in a quiet and, it's quite interesting that the community kind of self-polices that quiet around there. There aren't signs saying, shh, there isn't anyone going around like this. The kind of students do it for themselves, because they want to be able to engage with the material. And I think that sort of contemplative, deliberative environment, which is essential for a democratic society, should be one which a whole university tries to curate itself and to allow for that widest possible articulation of human difference to be reflected in its organisation. You walk around this library, you see artwork that reflects the different cultures and communities that exist in the university, and I think that sends the kind of right message. It sets the right tone. Is that happening in your faculty building, Malick? Are you doing those kinds of things?
Right.
Is the university administration organising the whole campus to engender that inclusivity, that thoughtfulness, that deliberation?
That's great. Thank you very much, Richard. Let me take you up on a sub-question of the last two, which involves librarians and library staff. So one of the questions that some of us are asking here at MIT and elsewhere is whether or not, or rather, who exactly is included under the rubric of academic freedom and free expression. And we know that faculty are, particularly tenured faculty, and some worry that it's exclusively tenured faculty. So given what you just said about the libraries, and I find a really kind of stirring image of deliberation and sort of quiet contemplation that you were just articulating, would you like to make a case, or would you make a case for librarians, library staff, and perhaps other staff as people who should enjoy the protections of academic freedom and free expression? Would those protections be consistent with the role that they serve in the library and in the university? How should we think about the relationship between academic freedom and the librarian's profession?
I think it's a very good question. I don't have an easy answer to it, because I think to some extent institutions will differ from one another.
Right,
but I think generally speaking, my view would be yes. But there is a kind of a qualifier, and that is that libraries are able to do their work because of trust. So the communities that give us their archives trust us to look after it and to respect it. People who access our websites for our digitized content, trust us that when we put an image up online, it is actually an image of the thing that sits on a shelf somewhere, that it hasn't been doctored with, like the guy in India who found his thesis being faked and spread around online. So that public trust requires a caution in the way that library staff exercise their academic freedom. And I think it's more in the tone, in the nature of the way that they make any kind of public articulation. But I think they should be allowed to make that public articulation. But it shouldn't be done in a way that undermines the trust that our community, our industry has paid such a price, if you think of Ada Butterovich, to engender and to establish.
Yep. Thank you, Richard. Last question, and then I think we'll open it up to the audience. My last question is, if you will, it's in defense of censorship, if I can even attempt such a contrarian thing, with such an eloquent defender of liberty across from the table here. But what I'm thinking about is the expressive character of censorship. And one of the things that's striking in your book is how people who engage in censorship they actually are thinking about it, and they have a
Yep.
reason for doing it beyond mere
Yep.
destruction, let's say,
Yep.
of material, which is to
Yep.
say they wish to convey a political message
Yep.
through the act of censorship.
Yeah.
In other words, they're participating in public discourse. It's
Yep.
just that sometimes their actions will infringe the free expression of others. But
Yep.
given that censorship does have this expressive character to it, what do you think is the university's or the society's obligation to protect the expressive character of censorship without at the same time allowing it to infringe the free expression of others? I mean, is there a meaningful line to be
Well,
drawn there, do you think?
Okay, so I think there are a couple of points to make. So censorship is normally something which is done through the exercise of power. And that power can be misused. And I think we should fight against that. I think we should call it out when we see it and respond negatively to it. However, I think you're right that it does say interesting things and useful things about culture, and but we must separate out the act of censorship from the expression of the ideas that underpin the act. So those ideas should be allowed to circulate. They should be allowed to be part of the discourse on a campus or in society. They're legitimate unless they argue for violence or intimidation or any of those things which we should resist and push back against. I think where censorship happens, we should be allowed to call it out. If we feel that it's inappropriate, that we should be allowed to act against it or to speak against it. But we should also document it. I think it's very important that organisations like Index on Censorship actually document those acts because they are important to be recorded. And I often think last year was the an anniversary of the publication of Ulysses, which of course one of the most banned books, and you know the very often censorship is an act of foretelling of failure. As many of the acts of censorship fail. They either encourage people to read it even more, or that they're kind of desperate acts that are continually undermined. And the history of Ulysses is a great example of that. But also some of the other famous books like Lady Chatterley's Lover. I'm always reminded of the court case where the lawyer speaking to the jury, let me see if I can remember it right, said that he spoke to the jury and said, you know, I'm sure you'll agree with me that this is not a book that one would wish one's wife or servant to read. To a jury which was actually mixed gender at the time, but extraordinary kind of acts of desperation. I think often those acts of censorship. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
No, you are, yeah. I mean, if I maybe just lift a little bit of the veil on it, but I think, you know, on American campuses, the agent of censorship is often identified in certain circles as the student, as the faculty member. In other words, precisely as those people who don't possess conventional instruments of power.
Yeah. So censorship with a
so,
small c rather than a capital C. Yeah.
If you will, yeah. And they're engaged in expressing messages.
Yes.
But in so doing, you know, you run them to a point where their expression then conflicts with someone else, maybe a visiting lecturer's expression,
Right.
etc.
Yeah.
And so, but it's one thing to say, okay, you'll resist the government that engages in book censorship.
Yeah.
Disciplining students is, I think, a different and much harder question, as a lot of universities are finding out right now. Exactly how do you do this?
Yeah.
You know, who do you hold responsible, and how do you handle that? Seems to me a very complicated question.
Yeah,
so
no,
that's because it is itself embedded in
Yeah.
the whole expression business. You know.
Yes. Yeah. No. I see where you're driving at now. I think that's where the kind of the ideas that underpin whatever that act of censorship, if it's kind of trying to stop a lecture happening, for example, you know, those ideas, the protests themselves should be absolutely permitted, and you know, an environment for those to take place should be allowed for by the administration of a university, but they must, in my view, even though many of these individuals I disagree with strongly quite often. There was one case in Oxford last fall, no, earlier this year, when was it? April. But I strongly felt that the person who gave this talk should be allowed to speak, and they should be given the room to say their piece. But those who opposed it should be allowed to make their voices heard. And I think the act of that whole episode in my institution was, I think, engineered to encourage the students to try to stop it from happening. And the students kind of played along with that and created a media storm that was exactly what was intended in the first place. It wasn't, they didn't want to stand up on a stage and say their piece and have the opportunity to share their opinion. They wanted to create a media sensation.
Let's open it up. Questions, comments from the floor? There's a microphone in the back that Alexia has. So if you want to speak, just grab that. Hi, Sandy. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much for this talk. I feel like Amazon needs to be in the room, right? Because I think many people who have the means, their aspirations to a personal library often begins with Amazon. And you began your talk with 1984, and there was a whole issue with 1984 a few years ago when people would purchase it from Amazon and find that it was filled with gobbledygook. And there was previously a lawsuit with Amazon. Amazon had taken 1984 off the Kindle editions.
Yep, I remember.
So yeah, I guess this is a question about thinking about Amazon and its relationship to public libraries. Like, if we are aspiring to trusted knowledge, where does Amazon fit into those aspirations?
Not very well, and not in any kind of encouraging way. I was talking a few years ago to Shoshana Zuboff. Do you know her book on surveillance capitalism? Very interesting book. She's at the Harvard Business School. And she was telling me that she had set Mein Kampf to be read by her students. And some of them came to her and said that we're very nervous about reading this because we would normally just order it from Amazon, but we don't want to get bombarded with right-wing, extreme right-wing kind of invitations to come and join us organizations and things. So she said, well, why don't you go to the library and read it there? No one's going to surveil your reading of the text. Oh, we hadn't thought of that. So I think this idea that companies like Amazon are the private superpowers is what we should hold in our head. In my book, I draw the analogy with the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. These are super powerful organizations that are very wealthy. They cut across geopolitical boundaries. They have kind of common kind of languages among themselves, and they can look into our souls. And so we must, I'm a great believer in independent bookstores, in trying to abstain from Amazon if at all possible, and other organizations of that ilk. Unfortunately, it's not always possible to do that, but minimize the encounter with them, and to try and possible for libraries to club together and to try and solve these problems by working with publishers or with authors or with communities ourselves, rather than going straight to these to the platforms, which of course they're incredibly convenient and easy to use, but the cost of it, the long-term cost of it, is going to be enormous and unaffordable, I think, for society.
Thank you very much for a talk that was taking us back in time, but also across space, and really drove home that these contemporary dilemmas have very long histories, and how custodians of knowledge really are at the center, I think, of some of these battles. I had a question about attention that I was picking up on the space of libraries and archives. I think that I heard you make an argument for public archives, public libraries, and yet, which are funded by states, right? And yet the most violent and large-scale, spectacular destruction has been at the point of regime change, the state wielding its power to change the discourse, change the memory. So I wondered what the role of, and we just heard in the last response also that the private option is essentially doing different things, but not quite, shouldn't be the custodian of knowledge either. It seemed as if community archives, community libraries are the space that those who are making that history are preserving that as well, and that should be supported. But that's an expensive proposition. To archive well, to preserve, you need the conditions, you need a lot of now new technology, it's very expensive. So how realistic is that? And as you have worked with sort of local archives, local communities, ultimately the big octopus eats up all the little ones, right? And in a context of trust that works. But even places like the Bodleian, the British Library, centuries ago, the best of imperial sort of, colonial sort of history is and continues to be preserved in these spaces. So, are libraries ever really able to escape that power? In time, we can sort of distance ourselves from that moment of the curation and the preservation, but it isn't really possible. I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to that in the space of these institutions.
I mean, I think there's a lot to cover in what you've just said, but I think you're absolutely right that, of course, libraries are agents of power in their own right, and the big libraries like mine have exercised that power over time. In different ways, sometimes negatively. I think we're in a period at the moment where we are, as an industry, reflecting on that, trying to surface it from our own histories, writing about it, being open to the criticism that is both implied and necessary. And also to re-establish, it's an opportunity to re-establish relationships with those communities of origin from where we have acquired. One of the slides I showed showed actually a group of the Ethiopian community in Britain. We have a number of Ethiopian manuscripts which have come to us through colonial activity or imperial activity of one kind or another. And we did an exhibition and asked the Ethiopian community in London to come and curate it for us, and not for us to curate an exhibition, but to allow them to make the choices, to write the captions, to tell the story of how it came to be that we had these materials. And so that's happening in the museum sector as well. I oversee the university museums, and my colleagues in the Pitt Rivers Museum are doing amazing work in trying to, change the dialogue with those communities. So we've got a lot to learn from our museum colleagues. And I'm just trying to think of the beginning of your interesting question. Could you just remind me of it?
I think it was on the fact that, on the one hand, the public university, the public library needs the state, and yet it is the state that ultimately is destroying what it creates.
I mean, it's a very difficult one, that one, and it kind of, some of it is around the kind of structures of preservation. So, libraries used to have kind of replicated print collections all over the place, and if one of those libraries burned down, let alone being attacked just that by accident, the books could be reconstructed because the same books would be held in other libraries or in the book trade. It's less easy to do that with archives, with unique materials, but through digitization, there is those better techniques now for preserving unique materials. And there are wonderful works like the Endangered Archives Program, which the Arcadia Foundation funds. The Hill Monastic Manuscript Library are doing amazing work at the moment in Yemen, digitizing Yazidi manuscript collections, and in other kind of dangerous parts of the world. So that role of preservation now has new tools through digitization and through digital preservation, and we must think about the web space, the online space as being just as vulnerable. So I think, yes, the bigger libraries do through history tend to kind of, I think you used the phrase gobble up the smaller ones. I would perhaps use different terminology to say that they support the other ones sometimes by actually absorbing them, but we often, we tend to keep the identity of those libraries alive in many ways, to document their provenance. That's one of the things which libraries are good at, those skills of documenting knowledge, the provenance of information. Where has this come from? And to kind of timestamp that. Again, that's all part of that kind of infrastructure of trusted knowledge of democracy.
Thank you. I, like Sandy, I'm from the literature faculty and very much appreciate the nuance of what we're talking about in this quiet and deliberate space. And I'm also, though, looking at the Guardian headline, where I feel like, and the school board meetings across the country. And so there are two such different kinds of discourse in which I think in one case, neoliberalism and liberalism have collapsed into one thing, and there's no trust of either. And in that world, whatever kind of fundamentalism, we've been dealing with this, as you say, forever. But I'm thinking about Hanif Qureshi's work, for example, of the last 30 years. He's been writing about, My Son the Fanatic, the Black Album, where students are the ones burning liberal books. And the intellectuals are the enemy, right? So in this world, how do we adjust that layer of sort of strong political, not just my opinion doesn't agree with yours, but this quote, I don't think there's that issue of trust exists, especially for expertise, because that is perceived in many contexts as the enemy of democracy. So can you say a bit more about those very thorny places?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. And I think, so these are forces that have been unleashed across society as a whole. They're not unique, I think, to the academy. And I think I think we must resist the temptation to feel that it's doom and gloom. And I feel your pain, and have experienced it as well. But I think, walking around this library, seeing students in the library space quietly, lots of them, it's busy, but quietly getting on with things is an encouraging sign. The same thing is happening in my institution. And so I don't think those kinds of opinions are generally held. I think we should avoid the assumption that they are. And I think that we should feel emboldened by the experiences of our predecessors to stand up to, I don't know, wearing the T-shirt at least, to kind of feel strongly enough about the role of expertise, about the role of nuance, of difficulty in debate and discussion. And we're having a similar, you've got this wonderful CAFÉ series coming up. We're having similar kind of structures being put in place this academic year in Oxford at the moment. And I've been trying to, and Oxford has a particular focus in its more recent history on debate. And the Oxford Union, which is this thing where the events of earlier this year, of, you know, all the kind of hype around a speaker who was tempted to be cancelled but did give the speech and so on and so forth. I think the term debate is unhelpful because it tends to assume adversarial positions. And that's what, at this moment in our history, we should try to encourage discussion and not debate. And because the debate, and again, this may be just a kind of a thing in the UK where the UK Parliament is a kind of adversarial body with literally people facing each other, that the Oxford Union debate has a winner at the end of it. So we must try to move away from this thing that it's a contest, that it's a battle, and to engender listening, to encourage and foster the idea of listening and discussion, and that's all part of the deliberation that I think is necessary for a healthy society. And if we can't do that in the academy, then where can we do it in the public, in the public sphere? How we do it is not so easy, but we've got to try. We've got to work on this, because obviously, you don't need to tell me to tell you that the generation that are sitting on the seats of Hayden Library right now are going to be the ones in Congress and running the private superpowers and all that in the future.
We are
I've got one
almost
more
at
question.
one brief question last, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Hi, I work in resource sharing, interlibrary loan, and I was wondering if you just had any opinions about global responsibility on information sharing, especially when we see destruction of libraries. And sometimes I think pillaging and colonialism has, and I swear to God, I can't believe I'm saying this, benefit in that places that have now, I'm not saying when it was actually done, but now the British Museum, the British Library, or the Bodley, and any of those that have these collections that might otherwise not be accessible to the world, but now they're in this private, locked down collection. So I was wondering what you think of the global responsibility of resource sharing,
Yes.
this piece of information, it's been taken, but it's got to be able to be shared to whoever wants to use it.
I think that's a really good point, a very important one, and one that
Yeah.
I think we do have a responsibility, particularly in well-resourced institutions like mine, to share that material, to kind of make it available as broadly as possible. And I think that's the responsibility of our age, and we have the tools. All that we need is the money to actually do it, and that's where a lot of effort should be placed. And to do that in dialogue with the communities from where those materials came, because and we have kind of projects at the moment looking at terminology, to try to get away from imposed terminology from the imperial era that we've just become used to and don't even notice. But when you actually are in dialogue with those communities and say, well, actually it's not called that, it's called this, and we have so much to learn, and so we can do this so much better in that kind of co-curated way.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your talk, for this really rewarding conversation, for the T-shirt. Where do we get that shirt, by the way?
From the ALA, you can get it on the ALA website.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Chris Borg if we can have free T-shirts for everyone. Free T-shirts and puppies for final exam week or something.
Okay.
But thank you so much for your visit, everyone. Thank you for joining, and have a great rest of your day. Stay tuned for part 2 of this series, which will be coming up in the spring. We'll send out an announcement about that. Have a great day. Richard, thank you again.
Thank you.